make sure that the Congolese troops are behaving in a way that is acceptable to the international conventions of conflict.
Now, Ivensla, getting back to you, I know your passion for taking action has come from your own personal abuse through your life, and you're very passionate about making sure that this is highlighted and dealt with. I wonder to what degree your own experiences have helped these women that you deal with at the City of Joy to open up, because of course it's such a stigma what they've been through in that society, and I wonder how much it helps in terms of how you can get to relate to them and get them to open up about their experiences.
Well, my experience with Congolese women from the last 4 years, and I think one of the reasons VDA made a decision to stay and commit so much of our energy and resources to supporting the women in the Congo is that they're incredibly strong, incredibly resilient, and quite brilliant women. And I think I've been very lucky in many ways to be in a very deep relationship with quite a few women in the Congo. And I think obviously being a survivor of rape gives me a level of connection and compassion. But what I will say is that I think the women of Congo are ready, truly ready, to make change. And I think with small resources and huge resources at their backs, the women of Congo can indeed turn the Congo around. And a lot of things that Marcus was talking about, like the failure of the UN, I just a couple of weeks ago, I believe, there were 2 South Africans who were held hostage in the Congo, and they were released this week. And it turned out that the UN people knew exactly where to go to find the militias that released the South Africans. So a question was posed at a recent press conference, well, if you knew where the militias were to release the hostages, why weren't you going and arresting the militias themselves? And I think part of it is an ennui, part of it is a lack of intention and a lack of will on the international community's part. Part of it is there's a kind of growing acceptability that this is what happens in the Congo, so we'll just let it continue to happen. But I do think that if people begin to invest in the women and put faith in the women and put stock in the women, the City of Joy will be exactly that, a place where women turn their pain to power and become leaders. I think as women move into leadership positions, we will see a radical shift in the politics of the Congo.
Marcus, you've obviously documented some of the terrible things that have been happening. I think one of the sets of pictures you had involved the abductions and forced rape and marriage that were being committed by the Lord's Resistance Army. Explain to me the kind of things you witnessed.
I just came back actually just last month from spending 3 months covering this issue in the Democratic Republic of Congo and also Central African Republic and Uganda. And Joseph Kony, who's been operating in the region for over 20 years, has been abducting children, abducting young boys and forcing them to be child soldiers, and also abducting young women, 13, 14-year-old women, and giving them as trophies to his commanders. If they perform well in battle, they get a wife. If they perform well and are loyal to him, they get a wife. And so many of the commanders have several wives. And I interviewed hundreds of children, many of them young girls who had been forced into being the wife of Joseph Kony or one of his commanders. They had to endure years in the bush. They had to endure forced rape on a daily basis. Many of them gave birth to children. And luckily, the ones that I managed to interview had escaped. And they escaped with children under their arms, sometimes 2 children, 3 children under their arm as they fled through the bush away from Joseph Kony. So whilst we hear quite a lot about what's going on in eastern Congo, which is extraordinarily good to hear all of this news, what we mustn't forget is what's going on in the forgotten areas of northeastern Congo and what Joseph Kony is doing to the thousands of children that he's abducting every year.
And I wonder, you know, when it comes to actually taking some kind of action against the perpetrators, I'd mentioned to Eve earlier about or talked to her about the conviction of that commander and 8 of his men. What have you seen in terms of a process to try to get to the perpetrators and stop this happening?
Well, it really does depend on where you look. I've been in Bunia, a town which saw horrific atrocities in 2002, 2003 to 2004. And I've been in civil courts there where local population have been held accountable for their actions with violence against women. I've seen people put in jail because of acts that they have committed against women in the region. But I've also seen men released just a few months later to go to their families with the payment of a contribution to the family of a goat or a few chickens, which invariably doesn't end up with the woman who was the center of the violence. I've also seen military courts there where Congolese soldiers have been brought up against military tribunals and found guilty, but then 3 weeks later they're wandering around in the town with a gun and sitting in the bars again, very close to the areas where the women who they violated just a few weeks earlier are living. And so it really does depend on where you're looking. As I said earlier on, I'd just come back from the northeastern part of Congo where Joseph Kony is very active, and Joseph Kony's men are very active, where the situation is very different. It's a question of abduction, and very young girls, 13, 14 years old, are being abducted by Joseph Kony and being forced into marriage to his commanders as a trophy in a way, a trophy of war. And these women spend many years as wives to the commanders and raped continuously. And many of them are forced to then bear children, and those children that they then have to live with. And many of them have actually fled with their children under their arm after several years being forced into these kind of bush camps of Joseph Kony. Horrific.
Now, Eve, earlier on, Marcus had mentioned about how the DRC conflict is so different because of how remote some of those areas are. And I know it's really difficult for a lot of the women because they can't get access to medical care in those areas. They still have to work in many cases to support their families. And I want to ask you to address two emails. I'm going to read them back to back. They touch on a similar theme. The first one is from Wesley Tiku, who wrote in saying, "If the government in Kinshasa cannot protect its people, why not empower local communities with the resources to protect themselves?" And the other one from the Netherlands, from Getahun Mosisa, says, "There should be a system that specifically works on the socio-economic and political empowerment of women. This way women can assert their rights and defend themselves." How do you regard that idea of local empowerment to give people a chance to survive out there in the rural areas?
Well, I think it's the only solution. And I think part of what City of Joy is doing and modeling, hopefully, and hopefully we'll get to build many City of Joys in the Congo, but the whole basis of City of Joy is bringing 90 women for 6 months and training them in their legal rights, in becoming spokespeople, learning what the justice system is about, healing from their trauma. There'll be agricultural programs, there'll be internet programs, and the whole idea then is that they then, after 6 months, go back to their communities and they share what they've learned. There'll be self-defense, there'll be all kinds of programs where women learn that they have the right to defend themselves, to stand up for themselves, to prosecute their cases, to go to trial, and to gather other women to be behind them when they do go to trials. And I think if we can really begin to create leaders and women who then empower their communities, we can begin to spread this empowerment on the local level and in the really remote villages where women don't have access to medication, don't have access to hospitals, don't have access to schools, and don't have access to protection. And I think with local leadership building, then women will begin to become leaders in their own community and make demands for those kind of local protection systems. I think it is the only way. And I think there's a difference between sending in arms, which I don't think will be a solution. And believe me, it's occurred to me from time to time when I see the kind of atrocities and massacres that are committed against women, when I see women now who I've known over 4 years and they've